So we're going to introduction now.
Okay.
Okay. So this is Chris Smith, who's going to share many of his insights. He has been a columnist since 1977. He's been with the Press Democrat, having gotten into the journalism game because he had a teacher in 8th grade who just could not resist sending him down this pathway. And so, Chris, we're going to let you step in and tell us a little bit about what's going on here in the community.
Okay. Well, hey, I really appreciate being here again. I've enjoyed speaking to the symposium a couple of times, and I'm sorry that I'm not there with you. And I look forward to getting back to Oakmont. I thought I would show you. I'm in my office in the newsroom. I thought I'd quickly. I'm not going to tour you through the newsroom, but I'm going to show you. This is my grand office, and I just want to show you. This is the newsroom on a workday afternoon. And I believe there are 2 other people here. And often there is nobody at the newsroom. Everybody's working remotely, and it is an exquisitely strange experience to be putting out this newspaper with no FaceTime with the editors and with our fellow reporters. Everybody's at home. And it's kind of an amazing thing to me, ever more so. It's a minor miracle that newspaper comes out every day. Anyway, it's a miracle, and it's ever more of a miracle now that this is something like 5 or 6 weeks. Is it that we haven't even seen each other, and everybody's working at home? So yeah, I've been at the PD since 1977. It's really been a life. It's a lifetime. Certainly, sometimes I feel sorry for people who just have jobs and go to a job and do what they do and like it to the degree they like it. And what I have here is just, I've grown up at the Press Democrat. I walked into this room when I was 23 years old. And on Monday, which will be tomorrow, tomorrow after the symposium, I will turn 66 years old, God willing. So I was 23 when I walked in here, and I'll be 66. Do the math. I wanted to start off mentioning a story that I hope you might have seen, and it was a very special story to me, and it was a lot longer story than I usually write, and it ran a week ago, Sunday. I'm going to try to share a photograph and do better than I did in the practice. Please. And I hope you can see that. And that is Ben Thornton. And Ben Thornton was featured in the Press Democrat in 2006. He was 3 years old. And his parents discovered that he needed a heart transplant. He was very ill. They got him down to Stanford for tests, and he went into full cardiac arrest. So at 3.5 years old, their son was essentially lifeless. Doctors at Lucille Packard Hospital worked on him for an entire hour before they brought him around. He was put on an artificial heart, an exterior heart, for more than 50 days, and then he got a transplant. He got a heart transplant. So now, after several months of recovery, during that recovery, doctors noticed that he wasn't moving his legs. So here now he's turning 4 years old. He's gone through this medical trauma. He's not moving his legs. And they figured out it was because little Ben had sustained a blood clot that cut off blood to his spine, causing the spinal injury that caused him to become essentially paraplegic. So now he's alive, but he can't walk. As a little guy, second grader, he learned that rather than walking with great difficulty and with a walker or a cane, he discovered that he liked using a wheelchair. I'll go back here. And that led to him starting to play wheelchair basketball. And then the kicker of the story, again, I hope you might have seen it, was a long story. It was just an incredible saga that this kid has been through. And he now goes to Maria Carrillo High School, not far from where you all are, and he is preparing to go to the University of Arizona on a full scholarship to play wheelchair basketball. He's the nicest kid. And this is the kind of story that really feeds me. When I hear this kind of story, this gets my blood pumping. And another kind of interesting thing about this story is sometimes people ask me, how do I get my stories? Well, most often, somebody tells me, somebody calls or emails me. And most often, that is not the person who is directly involved in the story. So like in this instance, Ben did not call me. His parents or his grandparents did not call me. It was a neighbor of mine who's a deputy sheriff and works with Ben's father, who is a deputy sheriff. I said, hey, there's a kid that I know of that you should write about. And so I hear from somebody a degree or two detached from the story. And I was so happy to write about Ben. And I was happy that it was a bit of a respite from the bad news that we're living with every day. So now everything is coronavirus. I know that you all are loyal readers of the Press Democrat, and I can't tell you how much that I appreciate that. And so you know that on any given day, the front page of the Press Democrat generally has one or two local stories, and then we have a mixture of stories written by the Associated Press and the Washington Post and news services and major newspapers, the New York Times. And we will have a couple of local stories on page one. And then we have stories from around the state, the region, the nation, and the world. The Press Democrat tries to cover the world, although we personally, with our own hands, can only cover Sonoma County, and that's getting more difficult because there are fewer of us. So anyway, on a typical day, you'll have a couple of local stories, statewide, national, and then on through the paper, and that's the way it is. Well, just to show you how all-consuming this current crisis is, this was Tuesday's paper, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of this, but every single story on page one involves the coronavirus. Every story. And I believe they're all local stories. Yes, four stories, all concerning the coronavirus. Then the local section, A3, this is the North Coast. Again, every single story on this page concerns some aspect of the coronavirus. And then you go to Nation World inside. Once again, every story has something to do with the pandemic. So we are, I was going to say we're working overtime, but we're not because the newspaper can't afford overtime. But everybody at the Press Democrat is working very hard to try to cover every conceivable aspect of this crisis. I'll tell you that one story that I've enjoyed, and I'm going to attempt to bring up a picture again. And I think you will recognize this fellow. So this was a story, this is just a screen grab from November. And it was the first time that I had heard the name Brett Crozier. And what happened in November was that the Navy sent out a press release. And the armed services do send out press releases to hometown newspapers when somebody in something exciting, a promotion, an honor, something exciting happens for somebody in the service, the armed services, their press departments will send out press releases to their local newspaper. So last November, a number of us here in the newsroom received from the Navy a press release telling us that Santa Rosa High graduate named Brett Crozier, Santa Rosa High class of 1988, had been installed as the new captain of the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt. one of the most impressive, largest, most ominously armed warships in the world. So I did a little story back in November, and I phoned his parents, and I loved with his mother, a wonderful conversation with Brett Crozier's mother. And she was a very, I hope that worked. I'm not sure. Anyway, if I messed that up, I apologize. That's the story. That's the story that I did back in November about Brett Crozier. So in November, I called his mother, had a lovely talk with her. This is a proud mom. And she told me how her son grew up in this town, and she credited his development as a leader capable of commanding an aircraft carrier. He credited our local Rincon Valley schools and Santa Rosa High School, his churches here in town, his having delivered the Press Democrat capably, and then going to work for the city of Santa Rosa. And out at Howarth Park, he was a lifeguard, and he drove the little train ride out there. And then Mrs. Crozier also relayed to me that he was 16 years old at Santa Rosa High School when he went to the movies here in Santa Rosa, California, and he saw Top Gun. And he watched Tom Cruise flying around in that, so an F-15, I shouldn't say that, I don't want to mess it up. But he came out of that theater knowing what he wanted to do, just like me knowing after my 8th grade English teacher suggested that I go into journalism. Brett Crozier knew he wanted to fly. Combat jets off of an aircraft carrier, and lo and behold, he did it. So now we know what has happened with him. That was very interestingly in November last year. I wrote about him. Nobody had ever heard of him. I wasn't sure I'd ever hear about him again. And now he is in the middle of this maelstrom, having been relieved of duty for what he did, reaching out to the Navy and in kind of a public way, more public than the Navy liked, pleading for more aggressive help than he was getting in protecting his crew from the coronavirus. So that was one of my favorite stories of this ordeal. I will tell you quickly that I almost had a national exclusive. And what it was, I received a tip that his wife, I believe it's Mary Crozier in San Diego, was going to announce on Twitter and on Facebook that he himself had contracted or had tested positive for the coronavirus. Now that was before anybody knew that. And that was kind of a big story. And so the only way I was going to get into that story, the only way I was going to get into the paper was to wait for her to post. Because I could not write a story that says reliable sources, reliable unnamed, unidentified sources tell the Press Democrat that Captain Crozier himself tested positive for COVID-19. I could not do that because that story, which would run around the world with my name on it, in the Press Democrat, that worldwide exclusive, would say, this story came from the Press Democrat, a newspaper in Santa Rosa. And by the way, Brett Crozier's parents live in Santa Rosa, California. So kind of let people imagine where that story, who the source of that story was. And that is not something that the Croziers wanted to have happen. So I waited all day right here at this workstation. I wrote a story, pretty complete story about Brett Crozier and breaking the news that he himself tested positive. And I had Mrs. Crozier's Facebook page on one of my screens. I had her Twitter account on the other. And I waited all day and ready to push the button that would have posted that online. The Press Democrat would have had a worldwide exclusive. And Mrs. Crozier changed her mind. And she did not, she never posted. So then that was a Friday. And then, so I just didn't get the story. And then if I can do this quickly. And then, this is the one. That Monday, the New York Times broke my story. It almost makes me weep. And here is the New York Times the following Monday. Navy captain removed from carrier test positive for COVID-19. And the New York Times quoted two classmates, or former classmates of Brett Crozier at the Naval Academy. And so they got the story, and nobody ever knows how close I came to having the one national exclusive of my career. Oh well, maybe next time. So right now we are in the midst with every newspaper, virtually every newspaper on earth, covering as the #1 story the worldwide pandemic. Now, this is coming 3 years, almost 3 years after here at the Press Democrat, we covered in this same fashion the firestorms of October 2017, and for which we won a Pulitzer Prize. Very exciting day here in this newsroom, very exciting day. Tears and hugs and screams, and it was astonishing that we won that award. This was a very big deal for the Press Democrat to win the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news for our coverage of the Tubbs and other North Bay fires. Okay, that was almost 3 years ago. Now, what it feels like to me is that now we and every other paper are covering the story of the virus that has spread like wildfire around the entire globe, and it's mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling to me, and I know to all of us, that newspapers everywhere are trying to figure this story out. What are the implications? What are the consequences? When is it going to be over? What's the impacts? And we've written about kids and veterinarians and single parents and grandparents and small business owners and doctors and you name it, as we tried to test or to gauge the impacts on people here of this virus. Now, oddly enough, as our newspaper and newspapers across the country are endeavoring to cover this story, and there is a huge appetite, understandably, for news on this epidemic, this pandemic. Despite this incredible appetite right now, newspapers themselves are under siege. Now, we're not fighting a virus. We are fighting one of the main consequences to our business of the virus, and that is almost a I don't want to say absolute, but a massive decline in advertising. And of course, advertising is how we pay our bills. But right now, who's buying advertising in a newspaper, in this newspaper or in any other newspaper? So you may have seen a story in our paper on Friday, and I have to admit, I'm not sure if you're seeing this backwards, but this was the story today. It looks backwards to me. I hope it's not backwards to you. Coronavirus loans aids the Press Democrat. Here at the Press Democrat, the loss of advertising has reduced the revenues. It was, I believe, $500,000 in $500,000 in March, $700,000 in May, $500,000 in March, $700,000 in April. And so the Press Democrat was in position of having to reduce people's hours and pay, and they were looking at layoffs, and we didn't have to do it because we got this $3.4 million federal loan, thank goodness. So we're okay, but there is the grief and the misery that is occurring at newspapers around the country is quite daunting. There are newspapers that have ceased publishing in print. They've stopped printing. And I'm looking for, they've stopped printing, they've laid people off. There's a heartbreaking story out of, I'm having trouble getting my eye on it. Oh, the Cleveland Plain Dealer. There's a story out of the Cleveland Plain Dealer that a veteran healthcare reporter was working herself to exhaustion covering this story until she herself was laid off. The Tampa Bay Times has laid off 11 reporters, and it stopped 5 days of its print edition. So the Tampa Bay Times, a very reputable newspaper, is now putting out a print newspaper 2 days a week. There's a newspaper in Concord, New Hampshire, been around forever, and it announced just earlier this week that it is eliminating all print except on Sunday. And just think what that means to its reader. No more print newspaper except on Sunday. You may know that the McClatchy Company, once one of the largest newspaper companies in the country, has filed for bankruptcy. And, well, I feel a little badly talking about boo-hoo, boo-hoo, but this is my industry, and I think we're all very concerned what happens when a town loses its newspaper or when its newspaper ceases to be viable. Even before, so again, what's happened with this crisis, with the pandemic, is that newspapers have been drained of their advertising. The car dealers are selling very few cars. Restaurants, everybody. Most of our businesses are shut down, so they're not buying advertising. So newspapers are dying on the vine, and we already were struggling before the pandemic. In long ago 2018, and you probably read about this at the time, there was a study by the University of North Carolina School of Media and Journalism, looking at the health of newspapers in the United States. And it found over the previous 15 years, more than 1 in 5 newspapers in the United States had been shuttered. 1 in 5, just since 2004. And that the number of journalists working for newspapers had been cut in half. And that's a situation that has occurred here. We're still open and functioning pretty well, but I think, I would think that in the last 15 years, we may have lost half of our staff. That study out of UNC also found that hundreds more newspapers had scaled back their coverage so much that they became what researchers called ghost newspapers. And there are newspapers like that in the Bay Area. You may recall that there used to be an Oakland Tribune and the Contra Costa Times. The San Jose Mercury News used to be a massive newspaper, very important and powerful newspaper. And now they are all shadows of themselves. Well, the Oakland Tribune doesn't exist anymore, neither does the Contra Costa Times. There's something called the East Bay Times. So what's happening in the East Bay and elsewhere around the country is that your community may still get a newspaper, and that newspaper may try to trick you into thinking it's still your community newspaper, but actually it's this big centralized operation, and that newspaper is covering 5 or 6 or 7 towns and 2 or 3 counties. And so they do deliver you a newspaper, but there's probably very little news about your town in it. It's not really your community newspaper anymore. So anyway, that is happening across the country. Newspapers were already stressed, and now in this time of pandemic, we are much more deeply stressed. So what are newspapers doing to survive? Certainly one thing they're doing is trying to persuade people who read online. Most people now read, if they read a paper, they read it online. And many of those people don't want to pay anything, and that's reasonable, but they're not really thinking this through. If they don't pay something for their newspaper, their digital newspaper, then how, excuse me, I'm drinking water, how does the newspaper pay reporters and photographers and editors? So again, so even before the pandemic, we had problems, and we've tried to address it. So we're trying to improve our to build the number of people who read it online and actually subscribe and pay for it. And one little, excuse me, one silver lining in the pandemic and its effects, its consequences, are that the newspaper has seen a rather dramatic increase in online subscriptions just this year, sort of since it happened. So there are people who are as much as saying this news is important to us. The Press Democrat's coverage of this pandemic is important to us. We read it online and we will pay for it. Thank goodness. So every newspaper is trying to increase its sales of virtual subscriptions. Also, something else that newspapers are doing is getting into more events, and the Press Democrat has become, much more than in the past, an event host. You may be aware of the Women in Conversation series. This series, hosted by the PD, has filled the Wells Fargo, what is it? The LBC. No, thank you. My wife is asking this. We were going to have Laura Dern here on March 25th, and I believe the room would have been full. I'm sorry, it is the LBC. And of course, it had to be scrubbed. So there again, we've got, that could have been a pretty profitable evening for the Press Democrat, and it's gone. So we're trying to get digital subscriptions, we're hosting events, and then a number of newspapers, and I haven't heard of the Press Democrat doing this yet or considering it, but there are a number of newspapers that have gone to a non-profit status. Most notably, and I'm sure you know, is the Salt Lake Tribune. And this did just this year, the Salt Lake Tribune has gone to nonprofit. Or maybe this was 2019, but in 2018, as it was struggling, trying to figure out what to do, it was forced to cut a third of its staff. So the largest paper in Utah cut a third of its staff, and then did its research and decided to attempt going nonprofit. That's being tried right here in town, or not right here in Sonoma County. This is, I just thought I'd hold this up for you. Again, hoping it's not backwards. This is the Healdsburg Tribune. And this story in the Healdsburg Tribune is headlined, "Local Papers Moving to Non-Profit Footing." And what that means, if you don't know, I mean, what is that? The Healdsburg Tribune, the Windsor Times, the West County Times and News, and the Cloverdale Reveille, they're all owned by the same outfit. And the owners of that newspaper are transferring ownership to a nonprofit. And there will be money exchanged, but the current owners say they're not going to get any of it. So they are transferring the ownership of this small network of weeklies to a nonprofit. They are going to attempt to raise some serious money, starting off $1 million to make the purchase. And so they're going to be, just like any nonprofit, they're going to be looking at grants, gifts, memberships. And if it works, it will keep these 4 Sonoma County weeklies afloat. They were struggling for a solution, and I think it was about a year and a half ago. What they did is they asked for investors. These little papers asked for people to invest money, and they promised that if at all possible, there would be a return. And they got a few $100,000, but I think that worked out to be sort of a one-time deal. So these are most of the weeklies in Sonoma County. The most of the weeklies not run by the Press Democrat, and they're going to attempt this nonprofit model. You may know that, because I mentioned other weeklies, that the Press Democrat is also the owner, or our sister papers here are the weekly Petaluma Argus-Courier and the Sonoma Index Tribune. And then there's North Coast business journal, and Sonoma Magazine, and that is our little network. I'll tell you that I feel very, very blessed to have worked my entire career at the Press Democrat. When I walked in this room in 1978, actually in 77, I was a little over a year out of college, and I did start writing for the PD, but I was a correspondent up in Fort Bragg and Mendocino. So I was not an employee, I was a contractor, and I covered the city council and covered local crime and covered the school board. At that time, there were about 24 or more correspondents the PD had in little towns throughout this area, into Mendocino County, Lake County, throughout Sonoma, West County. And so you'd get these little briefs about bake sales and school starting and, a barn burning, whatever. And it was kind of nice. There was all this small town news in the Press Democrat back, 30, 40 years ago that was written by these correspondents. Well, they're all gone now. And so I did that in Fort Bragg and Mendocino, had a lot of fun. And then very, very, very fortunately, the PD offered me a staff job in early 78. So when I walked in here, we were writing on typewriters. Anybody remember a typewriter? And we were editing our copy with soft lead pencils, and there were actually linotype machines in this building. There's that massive machine where the old guy with the green visor is tapping out every single word. He's got your story, and he's tapping out every single character and producing these lines of lead. And from that, the plate is made for the press. And in those days, I'll say, Sonoma County was growing tremendously in the 80s, and the 70s and the 80s, tremendous growth in Sonoma County. And one thing that I remember coming to the Press Democrat is that there was talk that one of the distinctions of the PD was that the newspaper consistently had more subscribers, and of course back then it was all print subscribers. There were no online subscribers. One that the Press Democrat consistently had more. Its number of subscribers exceeded the population of Santa Rosa consistently. How could that happen? How could the Santa Rosa Press Democrat have more subscribers than there are people in Santa Rosa? And it's because it had this vast regional coverage. So we had all of, not just Santa Rosa, but Sonoma County, and then a very significant presence in Mendocino County and Lake County, bits of Napa. And even to this day, if you ever go up, make it up into Humboldt County, you'll see Press Democrat stands. Or people in Humboldt County read the Press Democrat. So our circulation at one time, our paid circulation was in excess of 100,000. It may have been 110,000 subscribers. And that was about the time that the New York Times bought us, because they saw the potential of the Press Democrat. And so from 1985 to 2010, we were owned by the New York Times newspaper group. And just to give you an idea of what's happened since then, again, that we had, remember, in the 80s, we had well in excess of 100,000 subscribers. We now have, I just got this from the publisher the other day, our paid print subscriptions, 32,000 print, and about 11,000 digital. And that, again, that 11,000 is up significantly. We're excited about that 11,000 digital subscribers. And conceivably, the day may come, I think it kind of has to, when there will be no print subscribers, because it's just no longer viable, no longer sustainable to print a newspaper and deliver it to people's front doors, and will be 100% digital. And the question is, the $64,000 question is, will we be taking enough money from these digital subscribers to pay the priestly salaries of people like myself. I hope so. I think I will conclude. I'm looking most forward to having a conversation with you all. I will conclude by saying here at the Press Democrat, we're doing our best at a trying time, like everybody is. Everybody is doing their best at a most trying time. And we're looking forward to getting back to some degree of normalcy and getting back to our previous struggle for survival. And thank you for having me. And again, I look forward to seeing you in Oakmont. Okay. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Chris. So Chris will be joining us for a Q&A session at 11 a.m. on Sunday. And all the instructions for how to sign into that will be on the Oakmont Sunday Symposium.org website. We will be posting this video tomorrow. And I cannot thank you enough, Chris, for having shared with us the current state of the world.
Hey, thank you.
All right, we will